Okay, I'll go ahead and start. Today's contract training, we're going to be discussing the closing of the buyer's property contingency, the bump clause, and secondary offers. So let's see how they work with one another as well. Before we begin, are there any questions from just general contract questions or anything that came up for anybody in the past couple of weeks that they want to ask about? Sharon, are you with the North Shore office? Must be. Brittany, for you, anything that came up?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, not right now. Thank you.
All right.
To answer your question, I am with the North Shore office.
Oh, good. Okay, awesome. All right, again, so the closing of buyer's property contingency, the bump clause, and writing secondary offers and how they all work with one another. I think another person has joined. So the closing of the buyer's property contingency, that is lines 330 and 336 in the offer to purchase. Collapse you guys so I can see here. So oftentimes, or sometimes it may be the case where a buyer will need to close on their current property, sell their current property that they live in before they can move on and close on another home. They need the funds from the sale of their property to use towards the down payment on their next purchase. So if that is the case, then you would use this contingency. And the way that it reads, this offer is contingent upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at, and then in that line 331, you would enter in their current address, no later than, and you would enter, likely you would enter the close date of this purchase. So if you wrote a closing date of October 31st into your offer to purchase, you would likely put that, you would mirror that with this on line 332. If the closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void unless buyer delivers to seller on or before the deadline reasonable written verification from a financial institution or third party in control of the buyer's funds. The buyer has, at the time of verification, sufficient funds to close or proof of bridge loan financing, along with a written notice waiving this contingency. So let's break this down. So this actually was a revision from the way that the prior offer to purchase read. There was no, it did not spell out what recourse a seller had or the pathway in which the offer would go if this deadline came and went and the buyer's current house sale did not close. But now it is clear. So if it does not close by the deadline, the offer would be null and void. If they are approaching the deadline and the home does not close, the buyer has options though. So if they're coming upon the deadline, that October 31st deadline is starting to come up and the buyer has not been able to secure a buyer on their own home, or it's in jeopardy of closing in its current transaction, the buyer may still continue on with this offer as long as they are able to provide written verification that they have the funds to close. And most often that is done with evidence of a bridge loan. They would also need to supply a notice that they were waiving this contingency. And then beyond that, if that is the case where they're obtaining a bridge loan, that does not mean that the closing date of this current offer would extend. It would still remain the same at that October 31st. So the buyer is still obligated to honor that close date that was originally written into the offer.
Would you recommend that you do an amendment to the closing date if you had to?
That would be a conversation with the lender for sure. And then a conversation back to the seller. It can definitely be amended, but again, that's something that all parties would need to agree on. So if it is going to be the case where you feel that there's going to be more time needed for underwriting review or whatever the case may be, again, that's a discussion with the lender, and then a conversation back with the seller. So, but the way the contract is written, it's the current close date would have to stand. So, any other questions regarding that? No? Okay. So next is the bump clause, and that follows right after the home close contingency and the offer to purchase on lines 337 to 349. So the bump clause traditionally is used in connection with the home close contingency. You do not have to include a bump clause when you are writing a home close contingency, but more often than not, if you see a bump clause and in place, it is tied to the home close contingency. It used to be in the offer to purchase that you only would use a bump clause if you were writing a home close contingency. And it's really a protection for the seller to include this. But now, since the revision of the offers, the bump clause has been isolated, and you can use this in connection with other contingency items, the home close or the inspection contingency or the financing contingency. I have not yet seen anyone attach it to another contingency item. You know, that would be a negotiation tactic. You know, you'd have a conversation with your buyer on this, and if they're willing to waive certain contingencies if a secondary offer came in. So again, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be using it with the home close contingency. And again, it's an extra protection for the seller, because taking a offer to purchase with a home close contingency is a bit of a risk for them. So they would want to have this option of being able to do what's called bumping the primary buyer if a secondary offer came into place. So I will continue on with how it reads in the contract. If the seller accepts a bona fide secondary offer, seller may give written notice to buyer that another offer has been accepted. So the bump clause can only be enacted if the current seller accepts a bona fide secondary offer. If buyer does not deliver to seller the documentation listed below within blank hours, and it would default to 72 hours if it was left blank, after buyer's actual receipt of said notice, this offer shall be null and void. Buyer must deliver the following. So if it's connected with the home close contingency and line 330 of the offer to purchase is marked, then the buyer must provide a written waiver of the closing of the buyer's property contingency. Then on line 341 and 342, the seller might opt to have other contingencies waived along with the closing of the buyer's property contingency, or they can leave it blank. So in this, you could name the financing contingency or the inspection contingency. You would also use that line if you were not attaching this to the home close contingency, but attaching it to, again, the home inspection contingency or the financing contingency. Then, and line 343, any of the following checked below. So proof of bridge loan financing, or proof of ability to close from a financial institution or third party in control of the buyer's funds, which shall provide seller with reasonable written verification that buyer has, at the time of verification, sufficient funds to close. On line 347, you can insert other requirements if the buyer is going to choose to waive the home close contingency or any other contingency. And most often you would see additional earnest money. So the way it would work is if the buyer has written an offer with a home close, and I'm going to use the home close contingency as an example. If the buyer is writing an offer, if you have a buyer writing an offer with a home close contingency and the bump clause gets attached, what that means is the seller now is free to market their property and try and draw in secondary offers. And if they accept one, then they would go back to this buyer. If they accept a secondary offer, they would go back to this buyer and to the primary buyer and say, okay, Mr. Buyer, you have 72 hours to lift your home close contingency by one, waiving the closing of the buyer's property contingency, and let's say lines 3 or item number 3, you must provide me proof of bridge loan financing as well. And you must do that you must have that to me within 72 hours. Otherwise, I'm going to bump you from primary position and proceed with the secondary buyer. So you can see how that's a protection for the seller. Again, just accepting offers with home close contingencies just are a little bit more of a risk to a seller. So, and then in order, again, for a bump clause to be enacted, there must be an accepted secondary offer in place, and the bump clause contingency must be marked. So I actually had a question over the weekend from somebody wondering if they have an accepted offer on a home and a secondary offer comes in with and it's cash and it's better terms, can they be bumped from the offer? Or can the seller take that offer and just go with that offer because they're better terms? No, they cannot. They can only do that if the bump clause was written into the offer. But just because another offer comes along with better terms, it doesn't mean that the seller can just suddenly choose to work with that buyer. So,
Question about that, please. Why would I, as a buyer, want to initiate the bump clause?
It's a good question. You wouldn't want to. So I think, just strategically as a buyer's agent, I personally would probably try and attempt to get an accepted offer with a home close contingency, and then that's it. I would not include a bump clause because that would be a risk to my buyer that they might get bumped. The likelihood of a seller or listing agent coming back and countering with a bump clause, I think, is high. As a listing agent, if you received an offer with a home close contingency, you might advise a seller to want to include a bump clause for sure. So yeah, good question. You wouldn't necessarily want to include it if you are working as a buyer's agent. So, any other questions regarding the bump clause?
I had a quick question.
Yes.
For the bump, so would both parties be aware of this bump clause, or is that only for the seller? Like if somebody came in and already put an offer, obviously, into that house, and the seller has that bump clause, do both parties know? Or are they supposed to know, or is that just something that the seller knows?
Well, between the primary buyer and the seller, they both know about the bump clause. But do you mean if a secondary offer comes in?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, good question. This is the one term of an offer that you are able to reveal to another potential buyer. So, yes, the listing agent would want to communicate with the secondary buyer's agent that there is a bump clause.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. They would want to know that. And then we'll go into secondary offers and I'll let you know how that works with the bump clause too.
Okay.
So again, and if you ever have questions about using the bump clause in connection with another contingency item, I would say, like, let's talk through it between myself and Kimmy. It's not too often. I think if you're writing in competition, maybe that is something that could be advantageous for a buyer to include. Advantageous because it's a term that a seller might want to see. If the buyer is willing to waive a home inspection contingency item, like prior to it being resolved, that's would be a pretty strong tactic to use with writing in competition. But I don't want to go too much into that. I think that's just a conversation for if it were to come up. All right, let us move on to the secondary offer. So when you're writing a secondary offer, you would write your offers exactly the same, except you would now check mark this box, line 350. The secondary offer language follows right after the bump clause language in the offer to purchase. So it's lines 350 to 356. And you would use this when the buyer knows that there's an accepted primary offer, but they want to throw their hat in the ring just to see if it would work out for them to be moved into primary position. More often than not, they are writing in secondary position because they know that the primary offer has a home close contingency. So that communication would come from the listing agent. And then beyond that, if you are showing properties, like let's say you're looking through the MLS and there's a property that's showing as active, but in the private remarks you see there's an accepted offer with a bump clause. That is one way that a listing agent can communicate to the rest of the agents that there is a home close contingency and that there's a bump clause. So you might see that in private remarks. And again, kind of backtracking, if there is a home close contingency with a bump clause, the listing agent may leave that as active in MLS. That is the only time that if there's an accepted offer that they're able to leave it as active in MLS. And again, that's so that the seller can try and accept more offers. So, okay, so I will read this. This offer is secondary to a prior accepted offer. This offer shall become primary upon delivery of written notice to buyer that this offer is primary. Unless otherwise provided, seller is not obligated to give buyer notice prior to any deadline, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. Buyer may declare this offer null and void by delivering written notice of withdrawal to seller prior to delivery of seller's notice that this offer is primary. Buyer may not deliver notice of withdrawal earlier than blank days. 7 is the default if it's left blank after acceptance of this offer. All other offer deadlines which run from acceptance shall run from the time this offer becomes primary. So if you're writing a secondary offer, the buyer is agreeing to stay in secondary position for a time. And that's where that line 354 comes into play. So buyer may not deliver notice of withdrawal earlier than, and we'll say 7 days because that's the default, after acceptance of this offer. So the buyer is saying to the seller, I'm going to remain in secondary position, at least for that 7 days. Once that 7 days comes and goes, the buyer, if they choose, may stay in secondary position. It doesn't mean that the offer is null and void once that 7 days comes and goes. It now just means that the buyer has the option to withdraw the secondary offer if they choose. Like if day 8 comes and they're like, there's no hope that the primary buyer is going away, I'm just gonna cut my losses and go, I'm gonna serve notice and withdraw my offer. So where this deadline days will come into play, if you know that you are writing on a property that has a home close contingency with a bump clause, you're going to want to find out what that bump clause notice, what the bump clause deadline is. So if it's a 48-hour bump written into the primary offer, kind of gets confusing, but if there's a 48-hour bump clause written into the primary offer, this secondary offer, you're going to want to make sure that that line 354 at least says that 48 hours. Because if this offer gets accepted as a secondary and the listing agent then goes to serve notice to that primary buyer that a secondary offer has been accepted, then that 48 hours kicks in. And so you, as the secondary buyer, need to hang in position until that 48 hours is up. That makes sense. They should match one another. And you would find that out through a conversation with the listing agent. So primary buyer has 48 hours to decide whether or not they're going to lift the home close contingency and move on. If they don't move on, then the seller is going to come back to the secondary buyer and say, we're not going to move you into primary position. So if a secondary offer is moved into primary position, the dates and deadlines of the offer to purchase will run from the day that the secondary offer was made primary. So if a secondary offer is accepted today on September 21st, and it's moved into primary position on September 25th, the deadline for inspection contingency will start from the 25th. The deadline for the financing contingency will start from the 25th, earnest money, etc. So your communication to your buyer is, we're just hanging out until we're made primary. You don't owe any earnest money until we're made primary. We don't go ahead and schedule inspection until we're made primary, etc. So, and then on line, let's see here, line 352. So, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. So the seller, they can accept as many secondary offers as they want. And they are all technically equal. And they can, if their primary buyer walks, if that deal falls apart and there are 5 secondary offers that the seller can choose from, that is up to them. Just because one secondary offer came in first or last, it doesn't matter. The buyer or the seller has the option to choose whatever secondary offer they want. Now, that being said, a savvy buyer's agent will often include in their secondary offer that their secondary offer shall be made primary over any other secondary offer. So, which you could refer to that as the priority clause. And if that hopefully that makes sense. So,
Where would you put that prime priority clause?
You could put that in the additional provisions.
Thank you.
Yep. So kind of to recap, so these three provisions in the offer tend to work together. And when you see again, when you see a home close contingency, otherwise known as closing a buyer's property contingency, you're most often going to see the bump clauses attached to that. If you're going to be writing a secondary offer, more often than not, it's going to be because there is a home close contingency on the primary one, thereby giving the buyer a better shot at getting the house because of that home close contingency on the primary offer. Sometimes they'll write a secondary offer because a buyer, they just love the house so much, they just want to see, like, we'll wait until the inspection is over on the primary offer to see if it falls apart. They just love the property so much, they just want to hang out until they're through it, in the chance that they don't make it through. But again, you're going to usually see a secondary offer written because the buyer knows that there's a home close contingency on that first offer. So to recap, bump clause attached to the property contingency, and that is so an extra layer of protection for the seller, so that if they do get a secondary offer, they can go back to that first offer and say, you've got X amount of time to lift this, otherwise we're going to move on with this secondary offer. And then when you know, as a buyer's agent, that you're writing in secondary position, you're going to want to make sure that you communicate with the listing agent to find out how much time the secondary buyer is going to need to stay in that secondary position for sure. Does this all make sense to you guys? And it might not make sense until you're actually writing it, but do you see how they all kind of worked with one another?
Yes, so far.
Okay.
I do have one question.
Yes.
That might be kind of a dumb question.
No dumb questions.
So what if, like, if your buyer also needs a buyer's property contingency, would they, if they were offering more money, you would still, okay, let me rephrase my question. If the primary offer on the property has a buyer's property contingency, even if your buyer has a buyer property contingency, if they're willing to offer more money, you might still want to submit a second offer, basically, as long as the seller would be willing to wait again. Does that make sense? Like, would the timing ever happen where you're making a secondary offer where your buyer also has a buyer's property contingency? Does that make sense?
Yes, I have seen that. I just, as a listing agent, I mean, you have the option to write that for sure. As a listing agent, as a seller, I don't know how much sense that would make.
That would make, unless it's like getting to the end of their deadline.
Yeah.
Okay. The primary offers deadline.
Yeah, I mean, if they're, like, let's say the seller knows that there's not an accepted offer yet on their primary buyer's home, that might be a case where they're like, gosh, this still hasn't sold yet. So it might be, it might be the case where they're like, want to risk that. And then just move on to a secondary. And then also learning that maybe your buyer who's writing with the home close contingency, maybe they're already through the majority of their contingencies on their purchase. So, you know what I mean? So they're still writing with a home close contingency, but that buyer is already through inspection, already through financing, and they're just waiting to close. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all a case by case basis. But if they're kind of big in the beginning of the process, I don't know that it would make sense for a seller to accept another secondary offer with a home close contingency.
So, okay. So usually a secondary offer is almost always going to be like a cash offer situation where they're not needing those funds.
Not necessarily. It could be, what would be the attractive piece about a secondary offer would be that they don't have the home close contingency.
Okay.
But it still might be the case where there's an inspection and a financing contingency, like your normal, the typical contingencies that you would find. I mean, cash offers are always fantastic. So, but I wouldn't like make that if you as a buyer's agent was going to be writing a secondary offer, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a cash buyer.
Okay.
So, any other questions at this time?
Nope.
No? Sharon, you had a lot of good questions.
I'm good. Thank
Anything else? All right. I'll send you guys these slides. Again, if you ever want to attach a bump clause to another contingency item, I would say talk to Kimmy and I about it. But you'll see it mostly on the home close contingency.
I changed my mind. I do have a question.
Great.
How can I get a hold of you if I wanted to ask you a question?
Oh, my number. You want me to tell you my number right now? No, I didn't even introduce myself. So I am Kimmy's counterpart at the Lake Country office. So, 9 times out of 10, 9.9 times out of 10, Kimmy is doing these contract trainings on Mondays at 1 p.m. But I am here today. So my number, 414-248-9584. And again, my name is Stephanie Conard, Conard.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, you guys. Well, that was a shorter training, I think. So you guys have an extra half hour to lead gen. All right, I'll see you guys.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys soon. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.